They thought they had him cornered. They thought this would be the interview that finally took Trump down. But what happened next left the host speechless and the audience roaring. Stay tuned, because this is about to get intense. This wasn't just another interview. This was a televised battle, and only one person was walking away victorious. The cameras rolled, the lights burned bright, and millions of viewers sat at home, their eyes fixed on their screens. This was no ordinary interview. This was an ambush, a battle set on live television. At the center of it all sat Donald Trump, exuding his usual confidence, his posture relaxed, yet his eyes sharp as steel. Across from him, Rachel Sinclair, the network's rising star and a journalist notorious for her gotcha interviews. This was her moment, the night she would take down the former president, expose him, and cement her place in media history. She shuffled her notes, cleared her throat, and smiled. A smile that was anything but genuine. Mr. Trump, many believe your influence is fading. How do you respond to critics who say you're done? The words hung in the air, thick with provocation. A lesser man might have faltered, stumbled through a defensive response, but not Trump. He simply smirked. The room was silent, the anticipation thick enough to cut with a knife. Then he spoke. Rachel, let's talk about what's really fading. Your network's credibility. Your ratings are lower than ever. The American people don't trust you, and yet here you are, hoping that attacking me will be your big break. Her expression tightened, but she didn't back down. So you don't think you've lost support? Some say the political tides have shifted against you. Trump leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. The American people don't follow tides set by media elites. They see through the lies, through the spin. They know who fights for them, and they know who works for corporate interests. A murmur rippled through the studio audience. Rachel hesitated. The narrative wasn't going as planned. She pressed on, flipping to another card. Mr. Trump, there are reports that even some within your own party have distanced themselves. Doesn't that suggest that your influence is weakening? Trump chuckled, shaking his head. Let me tell you something. Politicians come and go. Some will sell out for a seat at the table, for a few nice headlines from people like you. But the people, they don't forget. And that's why they still stand with me. A pause. Rachel adjusted her papers, searching for a foothold. The moment was slipping from her grasp. Trump sat back, his expression unwavering. Your network has thrown more people under the bus than a New York City subway. But here's the thing. No matter how many hit pieces you run, no matter how many false narratives you push, the truth always wins. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel forced a tight smile. The interview had only just begun, and already the battle lines had been drawn. Say the trap was set. The media was ready to pounce, but Trump? He was 3 moves ahead. The tension in the room thickened. Rachel Sinclair, emboldened by her network support, believed she had found her opening. She adjusted in her chair, feigning a look of journalistic concern, though the gleam in her eyes betrayed her intentions. The audience watching from home could feel it. The carefully orchestrated setup, the moment when the interviewer flips the script, believing they've caught their subject off guard. She cleared her throat and tilted her head slightly. Mr. Trump, even some of your closest allies have begun to distance themselves from you. Do you think that says something about your leadership? The question was a trap, one meant to frame Trump as a man isolated, abandoned by his former supporters. But Trump was no stranger to these games. He saw the move before it was even played. He leaned back in his chair, giving a slight chuckle. Rachel, let me explain something to you. In politics, there are 2 kinds of people. Those who stand for something, and those who stand wherever the media tells them to. Rachel's smile tightened, sensing she hadn't rattled him yet. She quickly flipped through her notes, shifting tactics. But Mr. Trump, doesn't the fact that key figures in your own party have stepped away indicate that your influence is waning? Trump nodded as if considering her words, then leaned forward, his expression unwavering. You mean the same politicians who take their talking points from the very networks that have spent years lying about me? Let me tell you something. The American people see through that. They know the difference between someone who fights for them and someone who sells out for a favorable headline. A murmur spread through the audience. Rachel's carefully crafted setup was slipping. She pressed on. But surely you have to admit that losing allies weakens your position? Trump's smirk returned. Weakens? Rachel, let me ask you something. When was the last time any of those so-called allies stood up for the people instead of themselves? See, I don't measure success by how many politicians stand next to me. I measure it by how many Americans still believe in the fight. And let me tell you something. Those numbers haven't gone down. They've only grown stronger. Rachel shifted in her chair. The studio lights seemed harsher now. The control room, unseen but anxious, buzzed with frantic whispers as producers wondered how to regain control of the narrative. But Trump wasn't done. He glanced at the cameras, as if speaking directly to those watching at home. Your network loves to talk about people distancing from me. But here's what they won't talk about. The millions of Americans who are closer to me than ever. They won't mention the rallies packed wall to wall. They won't mention the small business owners, the workers, the everyday citizens who are tired of being lied to by the very people sitting in studios like this one. The crowd erupted into applause. Rachel inhaled sharply, gripping her note cards a little tighter. Trump leaned back once more, allowing the moment to settle before delivering the final blow of the segment. You see, Rachel, the problem with the media is that you don't report reality. You try to create it. But the American people, they're smarter than that. And that's why your ratings are dropping, while the truth only gets louder. Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The segment break light flickered on, signaling an upcoming commercial. Producers scrambled, desperate to shift the conversation, but the damage had been done. Trump had seen the trap, and he had walked right through it, untouched. She thought she had the perfect question. She never expected his answer. The commercial break had done nothing to cool the tension. Rachel Sinclair, still reeling from Trump's last response, had been handed a lifeline by her producers, an urgent reminder in her earpiece. Shift the conversation to policy, challenge his record, make him squirm. She straightened her posture, flipping to a new set of notes. The cameras rolled, the studio audience settled, and she launched her next attack. Mr. Trump, while in office, your administration was often criticized for prioritizing corporate interests over the middle class. Some say that your tax policies only benefited the wealthy while leaving ordinary Americans behind. Would you say that's a fair criticism? The words were measured, her tone carefully crafted to sound neutral. But Trump saw through it, instantly. He didn't hesitate. Rachel, I love how the media suddenly pretends to care about the middle class when it's convenient. Where were these questions when gas prices skyrocketed under the current administration? Where were these questions when small businesses were crushed by lockdowns? Rachel blinked, but he wasn't waiting for her to recover. He leaned forward, his voice gaining intensity. Let's talk about facts. Under my administration, we had the lowest unemployment in decades. The stock market hit record highs. Wages rose. Small businesses thrived. Minority unemployment was at an all-time low. Those aren't opinions, Rachel. Those are facts. And no matter how many times your network tries to spin it, the American people remember. She opened her mouth, but he wasn't finished. And as for the tax cuts, let me tell you something. When you cut taxes for businesses, they hire more people. They expand. They invest in America. And do you know who benefits? The middle class. Not the lobbyists, not the bureaucrats in Washington, but hard-working Americans who want to provide for their families. But you wouldn't understand that, Rachel, because you've never signed a paycheck in your life. A low murmur spread through the studio audience. Rachel's confidence flickered just for a moment, but she pushed forward. But Mr. Trump, many experts have suggested that your policies created a short-term economic boost, but were unsustainable in the long run. Trump smirked. Experts? You mean the same experts who said inflation was transitory? The same experts who told us shutting down the economy was for the greater good? Let me tell you something about experts, Rachel. They sit in ivory towers, write op-eds, and go on your network to lecture hardworking Americans about things they have no experience in. Meanwhile, I've built businesses, I've created jobs, I've seen what works. And the American people, they're not listening to your experts anymore. They're looking at their bank accounts, their grocery bills, and their gas prices, and they know exactly who's responsible. Rachel swallowed. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. Even the most hardened skeptics in the audience could feel it. Trump wasn't just defending himself, he was dismantling the very foundation of the narrative being pushed against him. She glanced at her notes, searching for a way to regain control. Mr. Trump, some would argue that economic downturns are cyclical and that no president can take full credit for booms or busts. Trump laughed, shaking his head. Rachel, let me ask you this. If the economy had crashed under my watch, would your network have blamed the cycle? No, they would have blamed me personally. But when things go wrong under the current administration, suddenly it's cyclical? Give me a break. The American people see through this nonsense. Rachel's grip tightened on her cue cards. The control room was now in full panic mode, feeding her desperate prompts through her earpiece. But Trump wasn't done. You want to talk about economic cycles? Fine, here's one. Every time a Republican takes office, the economy thrives. Every time a Democrat takes office, we get record inflation, businesses closing, and families struggling. That's a cycle your network will never talk about. The studio was silent. Even the most skeptical viewers watching at home couldn't deny the power of what they'd just heard. Rachel, realizing she was rapidly losing ground, shifted in her chair. But before she could launch another question, Trump delivered the final blow. Rachel, let's be honest. You're not asking these questions because you care about the economy. You're asking them because your network is desperate for a moment, something to spin, something to use for a headline. But the American people, they don't care about your sound bites. They care about results, and they remember who delivered them. A pause, a beat of silence. Then spontaneous applause erupted in the audience. Rachel forced a smile, but her hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her next cue card. Trump leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Next question. They always pull this card when they're losing, but Trump wasn't falling for it. The tension in the studio was now undeniable. Rachel Sinclair, struggling to regain her footing, had received a lifeline from the producers. This was her moment to shift the tide, to reclaim the narrative. She leaned forward, her tone adopting a veneer of concern, her voice carefully modulated. Mr. Trump, there are those who say that your rhetoric has contributed to division in this country, that your words, your speeches, your rallies have incited strong emotions, sometimes even violence. Do you take any responsibility for that? The question hung in the air. It was a classic setup, a move straight from the media playbook. Frame the question in a way that forces the subject to go on the defensive. But Trump was unfazed. He had seen this tactic before. He let the silence stretch for just a moment longer than comfortable before answering. Rachel, Let me ask you something. When the media spends years lying about me, calling me every name in the book, blaming me for every problem under the sun, do you take responsibility for the division you create? Rachel's expression flickered, just for a second. Trump pressed on. You see, it's funny. When I talk about putting America first, when I talk about securing our borders, when I talk about cutting through the nonsense in Washington, suddenly, I'm divisive. But when the media spends 24/7 demonizing half the country, calling them deplorables, racists, threats to democracy, that's just journalism, right? A murmur rippled through the audience. Rachel adjusted in her seat. But Mr. Trump, surely you can acknowledge that words have power, that strong language can lead to unintended consequences. Trump chuckled. Of course words have power, Rachel. That's why the media spends billions of dollars every year controlling them. You don't actually report news. You craft narratives. And the American people, they see right through it. The tension thickened. Rachel knew she had to press harder. But Mr. Trump, there have been instances where your supporters have taken extreme actions after your speeches. Do you condemn that? Trump's expression darkened. His voice dropped to a measured, authoritative tone. Let me be crystal clear. I have always condemned political violence, no matter where it comes from. But the problem is, you and your network only seem to care about violence when you can use it against me. Where was this concern when cities were burning, when businesses were looted, when police officers were attacked? You didn't care then, Rachel. You only care when it fits your narrative. Rachel's lips parted, but Trump wasn't finished. You see, Rachel, the media loves to pretend they're the moral authority, but they aren't. The American people have watched you cover for politicians who break the law, excuse violent riots when it's politically convenient, and smear anyone who dares think differently from you. And now, you sit there and act shocked when people don't trust you? Give me a break. The audience erupted in applause. Rachel clenched her jaw, flipping through her notes, desperately searching for her next move. Trump leaned back in his chair, a knowing smirk forming. So tell me, Rachel, when people turn off your network, when they stop listening to the nonsense, when they stop buying into the propaganda, who are you going to blame next? Rachel's face turned pale. The producers frantically signaled for a commercial break, but the damage had already been done. Trump had once again taken their carefully crafted narrative and turned it against them. This was supposed to be his downfall. Instead, it became his biggest moment yet. The air in the studio had changed. Rachel Sinclair could feel it. The control she once believed she had over the interview was slipping through her fingers like sand. The producers in her earpiece were urging her to pivot, to regain control, but she knew the momentum had already shifted. She adjusted her posture, flipping to her final cue card. This was her last chance to corner him. Mr. Trump, at some point, don't you think it's time to take responsibility? Many Americans believe you are a divisive figure, that your rhetoric has done more harm than good. What do you say to them? Trump didn't hesitate. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. Rachel, you want to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about responsibility. The media spent 4 years pushing hoaxes, spreading misinformation and fueling division. And now you sit here and act like I'm the problem? Give me a break. Rachel's grip on her pen tightened, but Trump wasn't finished. You want to talk about division? Let's talk about the politicians who spent years calling half the country racists and deplorables. Let's talk about the media that cheered while cities burned, but suddenly found their moral compass when it suited them. Rachel shifted in her chair, but Trump continued, his tone unwavering. See, Rachel, the problem isn't that I'm divisive. The problem is that I don't play by your rules. I don't bow to the media elites. I don't apologize for putting America first. And that scares you. That scares the people who have controlled the narrative for decades. But guess what? The American people aren't listening to you anymore. They're wide awake. A murmur spread through the audience. Even some of Rachel's most loyal viewers watching at home felt a pang of realization. She needed a last-ditch effort, something to undercut him. But Mr. Trump, surely you have to admit that the country is more divided now than ever before. Trump smirked, shaking his head. The country isn't divided because of me, Rachel. The country is divided because the media profits from division. You don't sell unity. You don't get ratings when Americans come together. You thrive on chaos. That's why every election year, you push fear, you push hatred, and then you sit back and act surprised when people don't trust you anymore. Rachel opened her mouth, but Trump wasn't done. His voice dropped slightly, commanding the room's attention. You want to know why this interview is going viral right now? It's because people are tired of the lies. They're tired of being told what to think, what to believe. They're tired of the corruption, the manipulation, the deceit. And the reason you and your network hate me so much is because I tell them the truth. And the truth is louder than any of your headlines. Silence, then applause, loud, spontaneous, uncontrollable. Rachel Sinclair sat frozen, her well-rehearsed composure breaking for the first time. The producers were now frantically waving their arms for a commercial break. The control room was in chaos, but it was too late. Trump leaned back, a satisfied smirk crossing his face. Next question, Rachel, if you've got one. Rachel exhaled sharply, but she knew the interview was over. And the worst part, the entire world was watching as she lost. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere, and the media, they were scrambling for damage control. The moment the cameras cut, the control room was in chaos. Producers barked frantic orders through their headsets, trying to salvage the situation. Rachel Sinclair sat frozen in her chair, her well-manicured nails pressing into the cue cards that had betrayed her. The silence was deafening. Then, as if on cue, the first notification buzzed, and another, and another. In real time, social media had already begun its wildfire spread. #TrumpDominates was trending worldwide. Clips of the interview, cut into digestible, devastating highlights, flooded Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Memes were already circulating. One in particular, Trump leaning back in his chair, smirking with the caption, "Next question, Rachel," was being shared at lightning speed. Within minutes, the video had amassed millions of views. Comment sections were ablaze. This is why they fear him. He speaks the truth. Rachel just got steamrolled. That was painful to watch. This is what happens when you try to trap someone who's 10 steps ahead. Cable news outlets scrambled. CNN's emergency panel convened to deconstruct the incident. Experts were brought in to spin the damage, suggesting Trump had dodged tough questions, that his answers were rhetorical tricks. But no one was buying it. A leaked email from the network confirmed what many suspected. We need to shift the narrative before this gets out of hand. Focus on framing Trump's rhetoric as dangerous. But the damage had already been done. Meanwhile, at Mar-a-Lago, Trump sat with his advisors, watching the numbers skyrocket. He took a sip of Diet Coke and turned to one of his aides. "We didn't even need to run an ad. They just did the work for us." Back in the studio, Rachel was nowhere to be found. The producers had pulled her from the next segment, fearing another disaster. Her network was now in full-blown crisis mode, debating whether she should take a temporary leave. By the next morning, even mainstream media couldn't ignore it. The headline on major news sites read, Trump dismantles host in must-see interview. The internet reacts. For Trump supporters, it was a victory lap. For his opponents, it was an existential crisis. And for the media, it was their worst nightmare. They tried to control the story. But some things are just too big to bury. Days later, Trump's approval among his base had surged. Donations to his campaign had spiked. Rally attendance numbers were growing. The opposition, once confident in their ability to manipulate public perception, now found themselves on the defensive. Trump, as always, capitalized on the moment. At his next rally, he opened with the now infamous line, "Next question, Rachel." The crowd roared. The chant began, "Next question, next question." He grinned, shaking his head. "You see, folks, this is why they're scared. They don't have the truth on their side. They only have spin. And when you take away their spin, well, you all saw what happened. A sea of MAGA hats waved in unison. The political establishment had thrown everything they had at him, and still here he was, stronger than ever. Rachel Sinclair's career, it would take months, maybe years, to recover. Some said she'd never return. Others claimed she was already in negotiations for a book deal, spinning her failure into a redemption arc. But the truth was, in that one interview, she had become part of history. And Trump, he was already looking ahead. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. This wasn't just an interview. This was a political earthquake. If you enjoyed this moment, hit that like button, share this with a friend, and subscribe for more. Because something tells me this won't be the last time Trump makes headlines.